Studio One is really where I do the majority of my creating, and a lot of times I'm doing complete tracks in there. I've actually migrated over to doing tracking sessions in it, at least for vocals. Wherever I can shave off 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. I mean, I know it sounds kind of manic, but when you add that up over the course of a month, it can end up being a day's worth of time that you save.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hello, rock stars. It's your host, Lid Shaw, and welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to meet with recording professionals, to hear their stories and learn from their experiences so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Josh Harris, a producer, composer, engineer, remixer, and music industry educator. He is a classically trained pianist and composer who likes to fuse different musical genres into his writing and remixing. His credits include top-name artists like Seal as his musical director and keyboardist, Madonna, The Killers, and James Murphy of LCD Soundsystem, while some of his corporate clients include composing and mixing for NBC, ABC, MTV, VH1, and the USA Network. Josh has received nominations by the International Dance Music Association, IDMA, for Best Remixer, and his music has been used in several TV shows such as MTV's Damage Control, Room Raiders, and America's Next Top Model. Josh is also a founding member of the Brooklyn-based band and production team, Lindbergh Palace, and he currently resides in his hometown of St. Louis, Missouri, where he is founder of the St. Louis Hit Squad, a collective of local artists, engineers, and songwriters. Outside of the studio, he's a gifted educator, serving as an adjunct faculty at Extreme Institute by Nelly, teaching entertainment and media business, and he has multiple courses on mixing and remixing on lynda.com, as well as working closely with PreSonus. In fact, it was here in Nashville at Summer NAMM in 2015 that I first met Josh, demonstrating to a room of producers just how awesome PreSonus Studio One is, and I know he has lots to teach us rock stars. So it is with great anticipation that I welcome Josh Harris to Recording Studio Rockstars. Josh, my friend, are you ready to rock?
I am.
Well, I'm really thrilled to have you here on the show, man, and thanks for listening in on my long intro. Can you introduce yourself in your own words and kind of fill in the gaps?
I don't know. That was pretty comprehensive. Hello, everyone. Yes, this is Josh Harris. Lidge, I think you pretty much covered it, all the way down to the adjunct faculty at Extreme Institute. That's one of the newer endeavors since I've been back in St. Louis, so thank you for being thorough.
Nice, man. My pleasure. It's a great list of credits. Tell us a little bit about how you got started out in audio and recording. So
many of the skills that I have now as an industry professional were sort of born out of necessity. I really, at my core, am a songwriter. It's just kind of funny to hear you talk about my history. I started writing songs as a teenager alongside taking classical piano lessons, and just sort of fell into the gear because you start hearing music in your head and you want to get it out. And I mean, you're not always able to just go into a studio and use someone else's room. Remember, this was the 80s and things were more expensive back then. So, get a 4-track, get a couple of pieces of gear and just start producing your own demos. That's really how it started. So you started out with a 4-track and something simple. I think on your website, I remember seeing an image of a Mac SE or something like that. That actually, it's funny. That was taken at one of those like shared corporate spaces here in St. Louis. Like I was meeting a friend of mine for coffee and we were just talking and I happened to look behind him and I saw that old Mac SE and I thought, I have to snap a picture of this. My first keyboard was an Oberheim Matrix 6. I still have it and still use it. And my first 4-track was a Ross 4-track. I don't think I was able to afford the Tascam 4-track at the time. So that was it. I used to have my Mac SE. So that's the original white tower where you just slide the floppy disk into the front there. Yes.
For a long time, I kept it in the basement. And finally, I just got rid of it. And I just knew deep down that I shouldn't be getting rid of that thing. It should be sitting on a shelf now in the studio forever.
They're museum pieces now. I think one of the old original Apple computers sold for like $1 million. There's collectors out there. They're rabid fans of the technology. But yeah, so I started on a 4-track. and, was in bands. And, I wanted to be Rick Wakeman and Keith Emerson when I was 15 years old.
Nice.
So, yeah, I wanted to be on stage with 7 keyboards and all that stuff. No MIDI, nothing. I just wanted to play it live. But then I got into sequencing and standalone sequencers, Yamaha standalone sequencers with the LCD display. Mm-hmm. Remember those?
I think so, yeah. You sort of a rack mount thing to sequence with, right?
Yeah. And that's where it started. So I wrote songs for my band in high school and just kind of, went that direction, then went to college at a conservatory, Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, and always did mainstream music alongside the classical studies and orchestration and all of that. I've always kind of been interested in the mixture of different musical genres, the guys I grew up listening to, the way they did it.
Tell us a little bit, we'll come back to this more in depth, but just give us kind of a brief overview of the difference between your first dabblings in MIDI and what it's like now with something like Studio One or any of the other DAWs that can do MIDI so well.
I tell a lot of the kids I teach how hard it was, how much we toiled over putting together music back then, where you had a sequencer, you had 16 MIDI channels and maybe one sound module, and you were trying to lay parts down, and you had 4 tracks and you were trying to bounce. The early days of MIDI, I thought they were really, really exciting because you could have one keyboard controlling sounds from these rack mount pieces, and it made live playing completely different than having to bring out a synth for every keyboard part. You could split your master controller into zones, and one octave could handle one module. And so you were able to really streamline the process as a keyboard player. It was really cool.
Yeah, but compared to what that might look like now, you probably wouldn't call that streamlined anymore, right?
When you think about how we work now, certainly people use laptops on stage as like glorified sound modules with one controller. But back then, MIDI really had a place on stage as well as in the studio. It was sort of a force in both areas. Now with, the current DAWs, to some extent, I don't want to say MIDI doesn't exist because DAWs do handle MIDI information, but everything's internal. Everything in the early days of MIDI was external with a controller and a module and another module and another module and then a mixing board to feed all those modules through. And now when you look at Logic or Presonus or Pro Tools or any of the DAWs, you've got endless amounts of synths in a laptop.
Here's a quick question for you. Now, what about, it's a big difference in what that setup used to look like versus what it looks like now. You stayed in the game all the way from then to now with this stuff. What are some similarities? What are some same ways that you like to stay organized so that it all makes sense?
I'm a Virgo, so I think I'm type A just by nature. And I do think that you could look at patch organization and the patch library work that you had to do back then as the 1980s version of how we organize our sample libraries now. If you notice, with the benchmark releases of Studio One and Logic, there's always an update to the browser. There always seems to be an update to searching. Now we have tags and different descriptive words that we can use to find the 5 kick drums that have a sub frequency in them out of our 1,000 kick drums, where patch and sound organization has always been there. This is just sort of the modern day version of it. And it's audio as opposed to MIDI.
Have you found that you like to organize the sounds based on the way that the sounds are similar in a big library, or do you like to kind of organize things based on what sounds you created and used on a certain song, and then you just go look for the name of that song to collect some of those sounds?
I don't know if I'm weird or freakish this way, but I seem to be able to remember sounds very, very, very easily. In the old days, when you'd have 1 or 2 keyboards, you would almost memorize the patches. In the Oberheim Matrix 6, there's, I think, 99 patches, and I knew what every patch was, what every sound was. And you'd have a song, and maybe you'd write down, okay, at the chorus, switch to patch 29 or something like that. So now when I use something like Nexus or some third-party synth plugin, I'm quickly memorizing a lot of the sounds, or at least the characteristics of the different categories. Because if you think about the way that a virtual synth is laid out now, it's not that different from the early Roland synths. Things were organized by, you had your pianos, and then you had your basses, and then that turned into general MIDI, so that everybody's patch 63 was the same, no matter what, whether you were using Korg or Roland or PV or anything. So now when you look at Nexus and some of these third-party plugins, they're organized by category as well. So once you kind of dive in there, you typically find your 5 or 6 presets, or maybe 10 or 12 presets that you sort of go to, and then you tweak them, and then you save them as user presets and things like that. And the same thing works with plugins as well. If you look at compressors and EQs. So I think that whole library aspect to today's DAWs, it does harken back to the early days of a patch library editing and organization.
Well, that's good. I mean, I'm somebody who thinks that synthesizers and drum machines and the newest DAW is just, I love all that stuff. It's so cool to me, and I always get excited about it, but I can easily get overwhelmed as well.
Sure.
So it's good for me to approach this stuff with some sense of what's a good way to do this so that it's not just a waste of my time. Let's say, for example, I get a new synth, plug in for the DAW, or it's a third-party thing or something like that, and I go, it's on sale, I check it out, I'm like, that looks cool, and I get it. What's the way that you advise somebody when you first get it, or how do you do it? What's the first step you do? Do you just kind of go dabble in it every once in a while, and then over the next few years you get used to it? Or do you like sit down and dig in methodically into a new synth to really understand it so that you can draw all those sounds from memory later on?
Yeah, the second scenario, the way that I organize my time in the studio, I actually set aside afternoons sometimes purely for sound organization and sample auditioning. Let's say that I have all these libraries in Contact or something that I've recently added or need to go through or have had for months and hadn't had a chance. I think that there's just different states of mind in the studio. It's very difficult to stay creative when you're scrolling through 75 synth pad sounds.
Amen.
Yeah, I mean, and especially if someone's in the room with you, that's just not the way to move the session along. So you need to find these little areas where you can trim the fat and streamline the process. And the sooner you learn your sounds and the sooner you have a handle on your sound library, the easier it is to just make music.
Yeah.
And just get on with it.
Well, I feel like you just gave us permission to play. It's not all just hard work making Jack a dull boy.
Not at all. Think about when you were a teenager. I mean, I know when I first got that Oberheim Matrix 6, I wasn't thinking about writing songs. I just sat around and played with patches and what does this do? Oh, that's the filter. Oh, that's the resonance. You have to allow time to learn your tools.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't be done necessarily while you're deep in trying to come up with bass lines and secondary and tertiary parts to build a track up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about a process for you. Would you sit down to start working on a particular song and have some idea of where the song's going first, and then you might narrow down your palette of sounds to begin? It's almost like you have to create a band before the band can start to jam together.
Right. That's a good question. When I turned 25, I started to actually hear music in a fairly completed state in my head, getting my brain to sort of hear music while I wasn't at the piano. You know what I mean? Like you're walking down the street and you go, whoa, okay, I just heard this whole section of a song. I need to get this down. I really don't sit in front of the rig and make music until I've heard it in my head enough. Maybe it's 40 or 50% completed, but enough to go, okay, I got it. Let me just go to work. And that's why the whole process of learning your sounds, not just your synth sounds, but your drum sounds, your loops, all that stuff, you want to be able to go, okay, I'm hearing a groove. I know what the kick drum needs to sound like. Let me sit down and pull that file in. Okay, the snare, next. And you just begin to use the studio as an extension of your brain. So I almost work like a classical composer that way.
That's cool, man. I like that. And so
Thanks.
It's like, I was going to ask you, it sounds like the sketching happens in 2 stages. One is when you're walking down the street and you start to have an idea, and I'll want you to tell me in just a sec how you capture that idea for just the initial capture. And then 2 is that Saturday afternoon when you're just kind of sketching your tones and your color palettes by knowing what your sounds and samples are.
To be honest, I think I hear some of my best ideas, or I've created some of my best ideas when I've been in the car. And I sing a lot of things into the phone. In the old days, I would leave myself a message on my answering machine.
Nice. And
maybe sing a bass line. But it can be that basic where I might hear 3 or 4 notes or a hook or a chorus hook in my head. And I'm pretty much a pop songwriter at heart. So almost everything I write melodically has that pop commercial sound. So I'll leave myself a little memo on the phone and It might just be a cappella, and then that'll be enough to keep my brain engaged and go, yep, okay, I got that now. And then I'll come back to it the next day or a couple days later in the studio. And the way I work now, because I've been a one-man army for so long, is I actually do my best to build the track, mix the track, and sort of fuse the composing, sequencing, arranging, and production all at one time, so that when the artist hears a track, because I do pitch a lot of instrumental tracks, or I might write my own top line or write a complete song by myself, I really kind of like the process to almost be this fusion of what I'm hearing in my head comes out in the studio, and I'm mixing as I go, and then I'm hearing melodies on top of the track I just built, and then lyrics start to come in from that point. And so it becomes this very channeled process.
Wow. So I like to ask our guests to start us off with an inspirational quote. I mean, we just dove right into some really awesome stuff, man. Thank you for talking about all the MIDI and the gear.
Sure.
But you got anything you'd like to share with us to just kind of launch us off and get us excited about recording in the studio?
I believe that the studio should be an extension of the way your brain works. And you should set your room up to support that, however you choose to set it up, so that your workflow, I'm big on workflow, capitalize on good workflow and the music will come.
I love it, man. What a great quote and great advice. I feel like I've seen that in so many different situations, and it's always such a pleasure to go meet some producer or musician in their own environment and see that process at work. You know, the people who have been really successful and inspired me are people that I have seen that they trust their own system, and they come up with a way to dial it in, and it works, and the work gets done. And it's, you know, it doesn't have to look like somebody else's. It doesn't even have to be the newest of whatever, you know?
No. I mean, I remember days of meeting guys that had 8-track hard disk recorders that blew me away with some of the stuff they just did with 8 tracks.
Yeah.
I mean, it was wild.
Well, like, you know, Brad Jones, for example, was my mentor at Alex the Great when I started there. And he was always really, really freaking productive, but he wouldn't really, you know, fall for the newest and shiniest plug-in and piece of hardware and studio gear or whatever. You know, if he had a way to get something that sounded like brilliant music, he was going to stick to it as long as it was working for him. You know, I admired that.
I think it's important for people not to be, especially the rock star listeners out there today, don't be seduced by the latest OS update. Gear manufacturers are in the business of getting you hooked on the sauce. And so every minute that something comes out, you need to be all over it because they're telling you to be all over it. Well, you and I both know that you do not update your Max OS when you're in the middle of a big project.
Yeah, which hopefully is all the time.
Right, which hopefully is all the time, which is why most of us stay 2 or 3 OS revisions behind, so that we don't go, oh, that's really cool, man. Like the newest Mac OS. Yeah, it doesn't work with that Waves plugin. Yeah. Nice.
You know, I jumped with my rig here. I went complete leap from Pro Tools 6 straight to Pro Tools 11.
Wow.
Because I had a system, it sort of hit the ceiling. I couldn't upgrade it anymore, and I just stayed there for a long time. And it worked great. You know, there were some things that I didn't have, you know, faster than real-time bounce. That's quite a good one. But I also had clients come in here. I think it was Pat Sansone came in, and he had a great comment. He looked at it. He was like, oh, cool, man. You're keeping it vintage. Keep it. And I was like, hell yeah, I'm keeping it vintage, man. That's not just because I got an old Pro Tools rig. It's because it's vintage, brother.
It's vintage. I have a Pro Tools 6.9 rig sitting right here.
There you go, dude. There you go.
So that's the new normal.
Well, so now how about sharing with us a story of an important failure for you? I mean, you've done a great deal of stuff. Humanize it a little bit. Let us know about a time where it didn't work out so well.
Absolutely. You know, I'm going to go to the Seal story for a minute. One of your other esteemed guests, Roger Allen Nichols, we were fortunate enough to do a Seal show together. I'll make the backstory really quick on this. So I've done some remixes for Seal in 2007 for a song called The Right Life, which was not a big hit for him. And it was a fusion of rock guitar and live bass, and Roger played on it. And Seal loved it, called me and talked on the phone. And then I was on a plane going to his house with Roger and a friend of ours, Greg, on bass. And we were going to rehearse in his living room and be the band for the time being while he was in between bands. Now, I made a couple of mistakes in this, and it's an important story because even though I am a trained musician, I had been in the studio really almost exclusively from 2001 up until 2008 when this whole thing kicked off. So my gigging legs, I didn't have them anymore. I hadn't gigged in a long, long time since I left Nashville in 2001. And I made the mistake of thinking that I could just slip out of the studio as a producer, and I know I'm a good keyboard player, and just put on another hat and just walk right out, and I would kill it as Seal's musical director. And so
you mean like I said in your podcast intro here?
Yeah. Well, but you know what? I did kill it in this sense. I killed it with my musical ideas and my arrangements. I killed it in the sense that I came up with new takes on his old songs that he loved, and that made the whole thing fresh. Where I didn't kill it was in terms of instilling confidence in, I just wasn't confident in my abilities on stage to the level where I could keep going and keep going and keep going. Like, it was a handful of gigs. They went really well, but he could feel that I was nervous.
Right,
you know?
right. And it makes it harder for him to exhibit confidence if the band's not confident.
I guess if I were to use the word failure, it was my mental state. I wasn't as solid and as strong as a stage performer as I was in the studio. And that's because I just hadn't done it in a while. So I remember when we were doing sound check for the very first show in Vegas at the Palazzo Hotel, we botched the ending. I think I botched the ending of Love's Divine. Mm-hmm. And he turned around and the gig was like 2 hours from sound check. And he turns around and he looks at me and he says, "Do we think that it ends there, or do we know that it ends there?" And so when that kind of stuff starts happening the day of the show, you get a little agita. You know what I mean? It's just,
oh man. So now what was your takeaway from that? Was there sort of a learning experience or a learning lesson that you felt like you could go through it better the next time around?
Absolutely. And the lesson is really this basic. When you feel nervous and when you feel excitement, they're actually the same thing. You just have to flip a switch and not let the nerves get you and turn that into, no, I'm excited. I'm going to be on stage playing with Seal. This is going to be great. Instead of going, oh man, I'm nervous. Wait, how does Love's Divine end?
Right.
You know?
Right. Well, that's great. And I think that translates into the studio as well. I mean, I know for me, when I've seen screw ups on the stage, the best approach is always to just keep it light and just kind of smile about it. And then everybody's having fun instead of feeling nervous with you. So I see how you flip that switch when you can do it. And the same thing happens in the studio. You know, when things get nerve wracking in the studio, if there's a way to kind of keep it light and keep everybody relaxed, you know, it's like all that nervousness just rolls off and you can get back to making great music. All right. Well, so now coming through on the other end of that, can you share a story about where things really worked out great for you and it really just sort of, you had this aha moment of this is working now?
Yeah. In 2004, I got a chance to do a remix of The Killers, Somebody Told Me. There had been rock dance remixes done before, and most of the remixes that I had done prior to this remix were complete reproductions where I would just take the vocals and that would be the only thing from the original that I would use, and then I would gut the whole thing and do like a ground up new track, new production. But when I got a chance to work on this, having been in bands and being a huge rock fan and a rock guy and a rock star, just to stay in line with the podcast, I knew better than to try to reinvent the wheel. So what I did was I used the guitar stems, the bass stems, obviously Brandon's vocals, and Brandon's keyboards. And I then just did new drums and did obviously a club arrangement and did some vocal tricks and stutters and chops and things like that. And I kept it really, really simple so that the integrity of the original was still very much alive and present in the remix, and the band loved it. And when that remix was done, it got a lot of attention. It got a lot of internet radio play. I think it even got some terrestrial radio play. And that one remix in 2004 caused my phone to ring for a while.
That's great, man. That's exciting.
Yeah, it was cool.
Were you in St. Louis at this point, did you say, or were you elsewhere?
No, I was in New York. I was sort of floating back and forth between New York and New Hampshire at the time. I had a place to stay in New York and a place to stay in New Hampshire because I like to get out of the city and clear my head and then come back in and do the power meetings and the power weeks and then leave for a while. But
nice.
I've always sort of worked a little bit guerrilla style, especially with the electronic music. I believe that you can make great music anywhere. And while I love gear as much as the next person, I think it's once you learn how to capture ideas well, it doesn't really matter where you work. I mean, obviously, if you're trying to get clean vocals and there's traffic outside, that's not going to work. But I mean, you don't have to get so hung up on equipment to where you talk yourself out of actually getting work done. But that remix was an exercise in discipline where you say, you know what, I'm not going to take it down to the studs. This is going to work. This is just going to work. The band will love it. I know they're going to love it. And they did. And I trusted my gut. And that's what being a producer really is about, I think, at the end of the day.
Well, that's cool, man. And I'm glad you brought that up because I've always been fascinated by the remix concept and that form of art. And I've never really known what to do. When I've dabbled in it, I've sort of always been stumped by, do I remix this and do I keep the same arrangement that I'm familiar with? Do I change the arrangement? What do you do with the verses, for example? Are there some general guidelines to remixing that people might just start thinking about?
Sure. I've lived in the mainstream dance world. So most of the remixes that I do where I have access to the full vocals, I will keep the original song form. I usually take out the bridge because I've done so many remixes of pop songs where the bridge sometimes just doesn't make sense in a club arrangement, 5 or 6 minute mix. It's unnecessary. You'd rather throw something else in there. Generally speaking, I will keep verse 1, chorus 1, verse 2, chorus 2, and then maybe change it up from there. The other thing that I like to do is I'm a big believer in instrumental hooks. I mean, going all the way back to Motown records, and you think of the guitar lick for My Girl and how that's such a signature part of that song. I think like that where, well, I'll put an instrumental hook after the chorus and that will be a signature part of the remix.
Now, would this be an instrumental hook that already existed in the original that you kind of work from, or would this be creating something that you're just feeling and hearing?
Typically something new that I would be creating. Obviously with the Killers remix, Brandon had some really cool parts in that song. So there was no reason for me to try to outdo him. I just used what was there. And I think signature hooks really help as a producer because so many producers are track guys now. It helps define your sound. Instrumental hooks are what people can hear one time and sing, or it helps them identify, oh, I've heard this before. This is really cool. I mean, you look at EDM now, I mean, Avicii and a lot of these guys, I mean, there's just instrumental hooks for days and days and days, these big keyboard lines and things like that. I mean, that's kind of what I was doing years ago.
Give us a few names right now that we might go check out in that style.
Well, let's see. Mainstream guys that have been around in the sort of public eye for the last few years have been David Guetta, the Swedish House Mafia, Axwell, who's one of the members of the Swedish House Mafia. I like him a lot. And I believe Avicii is also Swedish. Electronic music coming out of the Scandinavian area is really cool. There's also a production outfit out of England called the Young Punks, YOUNGPUNX. They're cool. There's a guy named Phonat, PHONAT. I actually like some of his stuff from 2009 a little bit better. He was doing some really cool sampling and chopping up and cutting up samples of 80s records. Really cool. And obviously Daft Punk. I've been a long time Daft Punk fan. Those guys are great.
Well, that's great, man. Those are exciting references, and I can't wait to go check those out. We will include links to all those to somewhere on the internet for you rock stars, so you can go check them out. You'll find that stuff in the show notes. I want to get into some tricks for remixing. Sure. But before we do, tell us a story about one of the strangest things you remixed.
When I got my start in remixing, I started working with a DJ named Mike Rizzo, who was getting a lot of traction in New York and getting mixes on KTU in the early 2000s, which was still is the big station there in New York. And Mike and I worked on a lot of remixes together, and then I went off and did my own thing, and we would still occasionally collaborate. And in 2011, I think it was 2011, he got a chance to work on a Sergio Mendes remix.
Nice.
And it was of Black Carnival, I think, Orpheus, Black Carnival, like one of Sergio's old tunes from the late 60s, I think. So Mike got a chance to work on this mix, and he reached out to me because a lot of the remixes, well, I would say a lot of my success as a remixer has been born out of the fact that I am a trained musician and I know how to sit down and reharmonize or pull the original chord changes if need be. And we worked on this mix, and it was weird. I mean, it was a weird remix to work on because it was a Sergio Mendes tune and it was decades old. And you kind of think, what do you do with something like this? Mm-hmm. And I just went down this road of a house record with funky grooving bass line, cool changes, Rhodes piano, like organic type instruments. And it came out really well, and the mix got nominated for a Grammy.
That's cool, man. That's great.
Yeah. That was a weird one where at the beginning, I mean, there are times where I've sat down and thought, oh man, I don't know what to do with this. It's just strange. And that's going back to my whole workflow of step away until you hear some percentage of it in your head and then go, oh, okay, I got it. And then come back and work.
I think that's brilliant, man. I've experienced different ways to do an overdub in the studio, but I find that one of the most useful ones is when you're in the control room and you hear the idea first, and then you go out and try it on an instrument, you know, as opposed to, hey, let's just mic up the piano, just go try some stuff and see what works, you know, and then an hour later, everybody's like, you know. I'm with you on that. You know, if you hear it in your head, you can go out and bam, and you can really get on a roll where you're creating quickly.
I think for me, that was born out of the fact that when I got to New York, when you're doing stuff, remixes and pop stuff and, you know, that sort of New York major label thing, and people are in the room and A&R people want to come by and listen to mixes. I mean, it's like you got to get it going quickly. There's really no time to just hang out and let me spend 6 hours on a synth pad. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, better just choose something simple that, you know, is common vocabulary, common vernacular for sounds.
Exactly,
you know?
Exactly.
Well, so let's jump into some specifics real quick, and then we'll take a break before coming back for the jam session. Would you like to talk about Studio One just a little bit?
I would. I have a good friend named Fred Campbell, who is a really fantastic guitar player who lives in Orlando. I think we just got connected online. I mean, we just started messaging at some point on Facebook or something and become good friends. And he was on me to switch to it for about 6 months. And I was frustrated. I'm very fluent in Pro Tools, Logic, Studio One, and Ableton Live. Those are the 4 DAWs that I know really well. And I know Reason pretty well, but I don't work in it too much anymore.
The 4 pillars?
The 4 pillars, exactly. I was frustrated with some of the quirkiness of Logic 9, and I had been a Logic user since 4.3 or 4.5, and there were just some oddities going on in 9. So Fred had switched, and he was all over me to switch, and I just said, man, I don't want to go learn a new DAW. I'm working on 3-4 projects a week, a month, you know, 8-9 different things in a month. But then one weekend, I reached out to Presonus and just said, this is my resume and I'm a Logic user and I'd like to talk to you guys about getting involved as a Studio One user, if that's something that we could, you know, we can discuss. And they were open to it. And so I was able to get a copy of it. And honestly, in a weekend, I learned probably 50 to 60% of it with no manual. I just opened it up and started. You're a badass,
man. You're a badass.
Well, I don't know if I'm a badass, but thank you. But it made sense. But here's the thing, going back to my workflow, if I can shave 20% off of my time in working on a track because the DAW allows me to be more fluid in my work, then I'm gonna use that program.
Yeah.
And it just did for me. So
well, it seems pretty exciting. I think that the features that it has in it look very promising. I'm just learning it now, so I can't speak from a whole lot of experience. I'm a dabbler still. I see cool things that you can do in there that are easier maybe than doing them elsewhere. And I just like seeing that it's something that seems to be growing. It doesn't seem like it's a stagnant app right now. It's you know,
not
developing it.
For whatever reason, people become very passionate about their DAWs. And I understand it's what you're creating your art in. I don't happen to feel that any one DAW is all things to all people. I very often work between different DAWs, but Studio One is really where I do the majority of my creating. And a lot of times I'm doing complete tracks in there. I've actually migrated over to doing tracking sessions in it, at least for vocals and bass or overdubs. I've been a longtime Pro Tools guy, especially for tracking, and I still love Pro Tools, but I don't know. It's just, you know, wherever I can shave off, you know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. I mean, I know it sounds kind of manic, but when you add that up over the course of a month, it can end up being a day's worth of time that you save.
Well, so give us some good reasons why you do vocals and bass in Studio One.
I do like the layers. The track layers is a nice feature, which is similar to the Logic's quick swipe comping.
What is layers?
So layers is the ability to create your takes. Think of it like a playlist in Pro Tools. What's cool about the way layers work is that you can see all of the takes that you have recorded, and then you literally highlight the sections of the takes that you like, and they get promoted to a composite track. And so you can really quickly comp a track.
That's cool. So it's the speed of comping.
I don't take a long time to comp. I'm kind of thinking about things as they go. And don't get me wrong, I can do it in Pro Tools. I'm very fast in Pro Tools, but I just have found the more sessions I've started to do in Studio One, it's clicking for me a bit better than it did, a year or two ago.
Well, I know that one of the features that it includes is Melodyne is sort of built into the app now, right?
It is. There's Melodyne Essential, comes with the Studio One Professional version, and Melodyne Essential is a pared down version of Melodyne. So you don't have the ability to select that pitch drift and pitch modulation tool like you do with the Pro versions. But that being said, Melodyne is integrated, so all you have to do is highlight an event and click Command M on Mac, I guess Control M on PC, and Melodyne will automatically pop open, read the file, and the blobs are there. So there's no transfer like you would have to do in Pro Tools, where you record it in and Melodyne would analyze it.
Right.
You
again, 20% saved right there.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me jump into some specifics here. Give us some tips. I've tried sequencing stuff, and I get frustrated because I really appreciate great grooves in EDM that I've listened to or in live music that I've heard. And then I go to program something and it just feels stiff and doesn't have any of that kind of bounce. Give us some really good stuff for us to start with. Somebody like me, remember that dabbler in Studio One?
Yeah, sure.
What are some good places to look to start making my track groove feel better?
I think one of the most overlooked features of Studio One is the fact that the quantization grid that most of us think of when we think of quantizing MIDI, the quantization grid in Studio One actually exists for the audio as well. So when you're in the song, and I do this all the time now, I actually set my global quantization grid to the MPC 3000 quantization setting at like 51%. I want to clarify what this means. What it doesn't mean is that when you bring a pre-recorded audio loop in, that Studio One then quantizes it to a 51% MPC 3000 grid. That's not what it means. What it means is that because I build my drums using one-shot audio files, so I will drag in a kick drum, drag in a snare, drag in hi-hats, and I will basically program drums in the song page like that. But as I drag my audio and place it, it snaps to the MPC quantization grid, much like quantizing MIDI would snap to the MPC quantization grid. And so that means that as you're building your beats and your loops, programming them from the ground up or using a hybrid, where I typically will use some hi-hat, like something like that, maybe from a library, but then I'll program everything else around it, just so that I get that hybrid of my programming and my DNA mixed with something that was pre-recorded. I don't think there's anything wrong with grabbing a pre-recorded hi-hat loop or a shaker loop or a tambourine loop and floating that in on top of your own stuff. It's the nuances of drum programming that are what make those tracks bounce and groove. The other thing is then side chaining the compressor, where you take a bass, and for those people that might not be familiar with this, it's that sort of pumping sound that you hear a lot. So you side chain a compressor with a kick drum, and then that compressor sits on, say, the bass track or a synth pad. And so every time the kick drum hits, it side chains the compressor, and the compressor pumps. And it can make for some very interesting rhythms. With dance music and electronic music, think about all the parts you're adding rhythmically. Like, yes, there's a bass line and it has tones, but really that bass line has the feel of a shaker pattern. Dun-ka-da-dun, dun-ka-da-dun. It's the same kind of pattern. So if you start to think about the parts you program, synth and drums, as all drum parts in terms of their rhythm and their syncopation, that can help too.
Yeah, absolutely. I was listening to a track, I don't remember what the song was, my daughter was playing it over Spotify from the back seat. And I just started noticing that the kick drum didn't really seem to change its tone, but it went from short kicks in the verse and then they got longer in the chorus. I thought, wow, that's such a cool, simple trick.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's, really, when you think about the way that electronic music was born, I mean, so much of it was born in clubs and the addition and removal of frequencies. So you'll hear songs where the low end of the kick is rolled off on the verse and then the chorus hits and the low end is brought back in. And so there's an omission and addition of frequencies throughout the song. And that's how DJs would arrange by, doing a cut on a mixer, drop out the kick.
Yeah, literally turning the low frequency EQ knob up and down.
Exactly. Right.
There was one other thing I was going to comment on about the quantization grid in Studio One that I noticed, and I hadn't seen in other software. When I would play in a part, and then I'd sort of zoom in on the MIDI window, you can see the quantized grid up in the ruler before I actually quantize the audio to that grid. And so I found it was cool because I could try different quantization values and different rhythmic patterns to see which one more closely matched what I had just played in my head first.
Right.
I thought that was very cool because it made it easier to, play something and then figure out what it was close to supposed to be and quantize it to that. Whereas in the past, I might have played something in that had a feel and then do 16th note or something, and then it goes away. And I was like, what just happened to what I played,
That's interesting too. Going back to giving your tracks life. I mean, something that I do occasionally, you can play with quantizing different parts with different quantization values, where maybe you swing the hi-hat, but you don't swing the kick and snare. Or maybe you play the bass in unquantized over quantized drums, you just play around with humanizing things, however you want to do it. And that's how you can give some of the programmed music a little bit of humanness. How
often or ever have you done a track where nothing was quantized?
Ooh, it's been, I will say that, yeah, I've done some piano stuff. I don't know if this counts, but
no, I mean kind of drums, EDM
drums, okay.
stuff, where it's got a rhythmic groove.
I've always quantized the drums and the bass. There have been times where I haven't quantized the keyboards. But if you think about it, a lot of the effects sounds, I use Nexus a lot on tracks, and Nexus has a lot of built-in delays and, it has wonderful effects, built-in reverbs and delays. And so those delays are dotted eighth notes. So if you hit a keyboard stab and it's off beat, then the echo is off beat, and then things start to sound messy. So
right.
I'm pretty anal about it, but I mean, I certainly think that I have done tracks that are not so much EDM, but are maybe like electronic groove bass, where I quantized bass and drums, and then everything else was live. Pads, strings, piano.
Yeah.
Actually,
go ahead.
One thing, sorry, it just made me think about this. One thing that I've been starting to do lately is I busted out some of my old analog synths, and I'll just play them in live. I'll track them through my Apollo. I'll use, either a Neve or the UA 610 print it with compression through an LA2A, and just do it like that, and just play my Juno 106 or my Oberheim in live and just double track it and do it old school.
That's cool. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I was going to give a shout out to one of our rock stars, Nick, who just came through Nashville, drove all the way down here from Vermont and played me some of his music. And I think this might even be typical of many of our listeners. He's somebody who was into recording on 8-track tape at one point early on. And then now he's just learning Pro Tools, and he's getting those tape recordings into the computer, and he's starting to learn how to work with them in the DAW. And he played me a cover of Talking Heads that he had worked on. And it just sounded so good. And it was exactly that. It was the drum machine was programmed, and everything else was just played in live with synths and bass and stuff. Has a great feel.
Yeah, I mean, I worked with James Murphy from LCD Soundsystem for off and on for a month in 2012. And after hanging out with him and just sort of watching how he works, that's what kind of brought me back to that. There's something fun about picking up that keyboard that you loved when you were 18 and going, I'm just going to track it in live. I got it. There's something to that. I mean, we don't forget where you came from.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're going to take a break here in a second. We'll come back in for the jam session. But before we go, rock stars, I want to remind you that you can find notes and links to everything we're talking about here with Josh Harris in the show notes at rsrockstars.com. Just use the search bar and search for Josh, and it'll pull the podcast blog post right up. And you can find links there. If you're on your iPhone and you're listening, click on the episode and it should blow up on the screen and you'll see the logo there. But if you touch the logo, it might turn into the show notes. And again, you can just click through with your finger to go straight to the blog post or to find the links there, including the links to the Mix Master Bundle, which I'm just about to tell you about. See you guys in just a sec for the jam session. Hey everybody, it's Lid Shaw, and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of Recording Studio Rockstars. I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate your time. And as a way of saying thank you, I've created a special mix tutorial just for you, Rockstars, totally free, called the Mix Master Bundle. With it, you get over 2 hours of detailed videos watching over my shoulder as I mix a song in my studio. Plus, I give you the free ebook that explains how I recorded the tracks. And you get downloadable multitracks so that you can practice your mixes, including the Pro Tools session file, using nothing but stock plugins in Pro Tools, all of which you would find in any other DAW, whether you're on Logic or Studio One or Reaper. Maybe you're struggling with trying to improve your mix technique, or maybe you just simply don't have access to multitrack files or can't record a full drum set in your studio. I wanted to give you a chance to create your own mixes from full drum kit, bass, and guitars recorded in my studio. The song is called American Winter, and it's off my instrumental record Skadoosh, and it's all available for you totally free right now. All you need to do to get it is text Mix Master Bundle to 33444, and I'll send it directly to your email. Again, that's Mix Master Bundle with no space to 33444, or you can go directly to mixmasterbundle.com, enter your email, and I'll send all the files directly to you. Thanks so much, Rockstars. We'll see you guys in the jam session. Cheers. Hey, Rockstars, welcome back. I'm here with our guest, Josh Harris, and we're about to jump into the jam session. Josh, are you ready to jam?
I'm ready to jam. Let's do it.
All right, dude. When you got started out in recording, what was one of the things that was holding you back?
Mixing, hands down. When you start out in recording, you know that something doesn't sound right, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is, and you want your stuff to sound done like the stuff you listen to. And I was so out of my depths in the early days of putting songs together, and I'd never used a compressor. I didn't know how to place a lead vocal, just the sonics. I mean, I guess just dialing in the sonics of everything kind of freaked me out in the early days.
And you know, one of the things that's frustrating about that too is every mix we do, it's really, in my experience, only going to sound as good as it's going to sound.
Right.
And the better you get at mixing, it just means that you get to that place of this is as good as it's going to get that much quicker.
Exactly.
And when you're first starting out, you might feel like your only option is to just keep working on that song. And it doesn't, it's frustrating because it doesn't always get that much better.
Yeah, that was definitely a tough one. I had songs and I had ideas, and it just was sonically difficult to pull everything together.
And did you find that just through time and just doing more and more recording and mixing, that's pretty much the process?
Yeah, I mean, you know, what is it, 10,000 hours to master something. But I just had to work on a lot of tracks. And in those early days, I didn't get a chance to work with a lot of singers. The remixing actually is what helped me hone my skills, because almost every week for several years, I mixed something with a vocal.
I like that, man. Mixing a new song every week. I like that.
Yeah.
There might be something in that for us, rock
There might
stars.
be.
I'll have to think about that.
There's no shortcut.
Here's a quick question related to that learning process of the mixing. Did you experience those times where you just knocked something out of the park and then later you were like, oh crap, well, how did I do that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big believer in things sort of happening in a channeled, organic fashion. And I think when we labor too much in the studio, that's not a good sign. That's just me. I think that the best work I've ever done has always been very seamless and very fluid, and there was an amazing flow, and I didn't overthink it, and I was relaxed, and it just happened. And you know, you hear it in your head, you get it down, you go, you step away, you go, yeah, it sounds good, done. And I think we tend to overthink things and leave things in a state of, maybe, I'm almost done.
Do you have a process of going back through your own work and sort of researching and dissecting what went into something that worked really well?
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know if you dissect things that didn't work so well, but
Absolutely.
At least something that worked great.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I've been spending the summer attempting to curate my discography from 2001 forward, and I have stuff scattered on different drives and mixes. And when you pull together 100, 150 different projects that you've worked on over 15 years, and you start to go back and look at things and listen to, here's where I was in 2002, here's where I was in 2001. I was really, really hard on myself in the early 2000s. When I go back and listen to some of that work now, it actually was really good. I was so hard on myself, and I don't know why. Listening to it now, I go back and I think, man, that thing I did in 2004, man, it was on point. I wouldn't change a thing if I did it today.
It's funny too, because now you're in the computer doing stuff, and back then you might have been out of the computer potentially. Mm-hmm. I've experienced it sometimes where I go and listen to something, I'm like, I don't know how I would make that sound in the computer. I think I had to do it the way I did it in order to even get that sound.
Yeah. And I mean, you've spent more time mixing on consoles than I have, but in the early days when I lived in Nashville, I mean, I was rocking everything through a Mackie 8 bus.
I love the Mackie 8 bus.
Yeah, it was 24/8.
I heard Daft Punk was rocking through a Mackie mixer as well.
They might have been. I mean, I had one in my bedroom on Woodmont Boulevard.
All right. So now share with us some of the best advice you received about recording.
We're in a service business. Unless you're doing your own artist album, as producers and engineers, really when you break it down, we are in a service business, and our clients are going to have opinions, and we may not always agree with them. And one thing I had to learn a little bit the hard way when I started doing work for major labels is that it didn't really matter what I thought past a certain point. It was going to matter what the artist or the client or the artist manager thought. And it's difficult sometimes to remove our own emotions from the work we do because we're passionate about that work and we want to make things excellent. But then there comes a point where you have to realize this is a track I'm doing for an artist that's signed to a label, and this is their name on it. And I have to concede on some things that maybe I wouldn't normally concede on. And so being fluid during the mix revision process and production revision process is really important.
And another reminder too is, how often have you sort of conceded to make a change that was requested only later on to go back and look and be like, I don't know why I didn't see that at the time, but they were absolutely right.
Oh, more often than I would have admitted when I was younger. I'll tell you something, it's very interesting. Arif Mardin, who is one of my heroes as a producer, there's an interview with him. It may have been in the Tom Dowd film, I can't remember, but there's some interview with him where he spoke about listening to Aretha Franklin and some of the artists he worked with give opinions and their thoughts on what was going on the production side. And essentially he was saying, like, why wouldn't I listen to them? Why wouldn't I listen to what they have to say?
Right. And I think as you get older, you learn to welcome those extra opinions and you kind of search for them. I know I do on the podcast. Honestly, I'm hopefully wise enough now to know that I'm going to screw up. And so I'm constantly looking for feedback and I'm asking for it from the rock stars and everybody else. If you guys ever have anything to let me know, please email me, lidge@recordingstudiorockstars.com.
Love it.
So, all right, Josh, enough with that little self-plug. Give us another recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something that our rock stars could use today, this week in their studios.
I think it's important to mix at a moderate level. I see a lot of young and even some experienced engineers crushing their ears, working at really high decibel levels. And I believe if you hang out in that 60 dB, the medium volume, where it's loud enough and then you turn it up occasionally to just check to make sure nothing's ripping your head off, I think that's a good place. Mixing is such an important part of what we do because you have to keep in mind that the clients and the artists and whoever's listening to the music we do, they're really only commenting on how things sound. They comment on the way a vocal sounds or a drum sounds, but they comment on the sonics most of the time, more so than I don't like that song. So with that being said, it's important to save your ears. And when you're working long hours in the studio, don't live with the volume knob on 11 and turn it down a little bit. Because I became a much better mix engineer when I started mixing at moderate levels.
Well, so quick question for you. Part of what drives us in the studio is this feeling of excitement
Sure.
about the sound and the music. And when we listen for fun, what do? We turn it up,
Yeah.
So how do you balance that where you're mixing at a low level, but you're somehow drawing from yourself the sense of excitement the whole time?
I do think if you're dialed in right on the mix, it can sound exciting at lower levels. I really do.
I know I've heard Chris Lord-Alge talking about that, where he claims that he was making more exciting mixes by mixing at the lower level because then it forced him to try and make the sound exciting at that low level.
That, and I also think that it's important to be very deliberate. I mean, I think sometimes we mix with our eyes and not our ears because everything is visual. So what's wrong with adding 11 dB of a frequency if that's what is going to make it work?
Goes sometimes to 11.
11. There's 11 again.
Do you find that you trust the vocal level nuances more when you're mixing quiet or more when you're mixing loud? Or how do you determine where the vocals need to come up or come down in your mix?
That's a really good question. I have found that if I mix too low, then I'm off with the vocal level. I'm probably mixing with the music the loudest when I'm automating vocals, so that I'm not lulled into a false sense of placement. And so that's where I dive in and spend most of my time is automating. I am at that medium to pretty loud level, and then I may go really loud to make sure that nothing rips my head off.
Exactly.
And then I'll turn it down low and just see how it feels. I have to get it up probably around 70 to 80 dB at least for vocals to really know that I'm dialed in right.
That's what I was going to say, is that I find when I'm mixing, I mix on NS10, so I'm already ripping my own head off. When I am noticing the vocals being too loud, it's that sense of like I'm stabbing myself in the face with the mix and it's ripping my head off. And so I think I experience that more when it's turned up loud. If it was down quiet, well, they don't bother me as much. They might be a little loud, but who cares, But it's that cranking it up.
And the other side too of it is sometimes verse 1 and verse 2 vocals can be off in level when you're mixing too quietly.
Yes.
I've had that happen.
Oh yeah. Good, interesting comment. And it's good to just kind of flip in the timeline from one verse to the other to compare as you go.
Exactly.
All right. So now share with us a favorite hardware tool for the studio, something that always seems to make your sessions better.
I love my UAD Apollo. I love the fact that I can track with plugins. It's really changed the way I work. I actually sold some outboard gear once I got it. I know that there's some people that will go to their graves upset that the Fairchild is not 100% faithful emulation of its hardware counterpart. I don't know that that's really the way to look at this stuff. Again, with workflow. I mean, I'm able to have some amazing vocal sessions and track my synths through the Apollo. I just love the whole UAD platform.
So now how about a resource for the business side of doing what you do, whether it's a software or a technique or a person, something to help our rock stars, stay in the game?
I think that the music industry was built on face-to-face relationships, and studio work is really at its best when it's face-to-face. And so I'm going back to face-to-face. I schedule a lot of face-to-face meetings here in St. Louis. I'll go out of my way to have lunch or dinner with people or go grab a drink or whatever. And I'll invest the time and money into traveling and doing the face-to-face, even coming down to Nashville sometimes and just saying hi to people.
Come on down, man. Come on down.
Yeah, absolutely, man. You can't run this career hiding behind a laptop or a desktop for years of your life. At some point, you have to get out and hang out with your people.
Well, that's cool. And I know we didn't really have a chance to get into it, but I imagine that what you're doing there with the St. Louis Hit Squad.
Oh, the STL Hit Squad.
Yeah, the STL Hit Squad is probably a lot about the face-to-face. And do you want to just comment on that real quickly about building something productive and powerful like that within any community? When
I moved back here almost 3 years ago, I very much wanted to get St. Louis people involved in what I was doing, which is mostly out-of-town work. I still have a lot of work I do, New York, LA, and even some work out of Europe. And once I got to know enough people in town and I was able to assess the level of talent that we have here, as much as I'd love to bring my Nashville friends back into the fold because I've used a lot of people like Roger on projects in the past, I wanted to be loyal to my hometown and give people here a chance to play on projects for out-of-town clients that were maybe higher profile than some of the local work that they were doing here. So I found bass players, guitar players, drummers, singers, and been using people when I can on projects that I'm doing for clients.
I think it's cool. And you branded it, you gave it a name so that people can always recognize what that is, even if you work with a variety of musicians locally.
Well, yeah, and I think in secondary markets, in non-music industry towns, there's this glass is half empty, pessimistic vibe where people think, oh man, how am I ever gonna get on something that people outside of my zip code know about? It's that sort of weird, dark thing. And I've said to people, look, I hustle hard for projects and I work on a lot of things. And if you fit what I need for something, I'll use you. It's not like what you guys are experiencing in Nashville where we have sessions at 10, 2, and 6, and it's very scheduled like that. But I'm getting people to be involved with things that they normally wouldn't be involved with. For example, I featured a couple of local singers here on some EDM tracks that I've done for Amethyst Music, which is a label out of New York that I usually do 1 or 2 original releases a year for. And I'm getting people involved with that so that they're having credits on things and getting their name out there in other ways.
Well, that's super cool, man. And I think it's an encouragement to any of you rock stars, anywhere else in the world where you are. Don't forget, you could start a scene right where you are if you want to. If you find that you have musicians that you admire, don't be afraid to just brand your own thing in your own city and start it. It's how it happened for everywhere else in the country. I mean, everywhere else just used to be a city anywhere at some point.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, so now how about giving us this is sort of a hypothetical question, which is imagine yourself starting all over. If you needed a simple setup to record, you needed to find people to record, and you wanted to make ends meet while you were doing it, what suggestions would you have?
Oh, that's a great question. For many years, I've been a believer in laptop recording. I was sort of front of the line of people in New York in the early 2000s to just invest into portable and mobile technology, going back to like a PowerBook G4 and an Audio Media 3 card in a Magma chassis. I mean, I was doing remixes and Logic on that in 2001 and allowed me to travel around and go to other cities and work. So I think that your home base is your home base, but the world outside you is really your playground. So I would get a top of the line laptop. It's worth investing into a higher end laptop that you're going to get 3 to 5 years out of, and jump on board with a DAW that you feel works with the way your brain works. Get a decent set of monitors, anywhere like in the $500 to $1,000 range. Treat your room well so that you can at least do some basic mixing. Get maybe an audio interface like a UAD Apollo Duo, the little desktop, or even like something from Apogee or Focusrite, and then invest into one, maybe $400 or $500 microphone so that you can do vocals or do voiceover work or something. Because once you can get the voice down, when you can record the voice in your own room, whether it's yours or you bring in a singer, then you're able to start to work with other people. Now you're able to get audio that's at a high quality where you can maybe, if you're a singer, you can become a featured singer and work with producers in other parts of the world. I mean, I'm a big believer in being able to have something that you do that's kind of your jam. Like my jam, I'm great at recording vocals and singing and doing background vocals. If that's what your thing is, then you go out there and you find people that need those services. Nile Rodgers would say, everybody's got an audience, you've just got to find yours. It's important that you have enough of a setup at home so that you can do competitive work, but you don't have to go and take out a $20,000 or $30,000 loan and get caught up in all of that. We know how that goes, right, man? We've been there.
Absolutely. That's great advice, man. And speaking of advice, now, if you could go back in time and meet the young Josh Harris, just starting out on his long journey of recording, what would you tell yourself is the single most important thing to becoming a rock star of the recording studio?
Oh, that's a good question. Patience. I think that's the word. Patience with my own skill set development, and then patience with how a career unfolds and how, like, the natural trajectory of a career. I mean, I think we all have suffered from oh man, this album I did, dude, next week my life is going to change. You know?
You know, how many times did you get sick of the conversation that somebody starts with, they come in, they're like, oh man, this one is going to blow up, dude. This is going to be so awesome. I'm like, please, just can we not have that conversation now?
Or when you're playing where I think there's going to be some label people in the crowd tonight. There's going to be some industry insiders. Right. There's going to be some industry people. Make sure they get in for free.
That's great. Yeah. All right, cool, man. Great advice. And I love it. You know, I think for me, that patience was being patient enough and believing in myself enough to know that that thing that I was into, it was worth pursuing and not giving up on too quickly just because it didn't work out perfectly at first, you know?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I tell my students the hardest thing that any of us have to deal with in this industry is the periods of inactivity.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. I mean, if you can find a way to deal with the periods of inactivity, because no working actor in Hollywood works 365 days a year and no working musician works every day either. If you can find a way to handle the periods of inactivity, no matter how long or short they are, then you'll be okay. But if you start to freak out, which we've all done, that's when things start to unravel.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars, Josh.
Thank you, Rockstars. Thanks for listening.
Can you let our listeners know how they can find you and learn more about what you're doing?
Absolutely. JoshHarrisMusic.com. All together, all lowercase. JoshHarrisMusic.com.
Awesome. Well, Josh, again, thank you so much. Rockstars, it's been Josh Harris here, joining us from St. Louis, remixer extraordinaire and composer and musician and producer. And we look forward to seeing you around the studio, dude.
Absolutely, man. Thanks so much, Lidge. I appreciate it.
All right, man. Talk soon. Cheers.
Take care.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444. And I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.